skipped the intro. I was just deciding that at the last minute. There's only so many you can choose from in the free restream thing studio, and it's like, nah, I don't want any of those today. So, and I don't think I have the ability to play any other video separately. So, unless it was in a browser tab, and if it were on my channel, I would get all confused with the streaming thing, trying to stream to my channel and play a different video. I was like, nah, I'm not going to risk it. So here we are. So I managed to waste an opening minute anyhow. And we're going to look at Gog and Magog today. And the first thing I want to show you is this chart I've showed you before. I've updated it again because that's what I do. Because I realized I was making a logical error. I was jumping to a conclusion that there's no basis for, which is that the tribulation and the wrath of God must start at the same time. Because the wrath of God has been poured out on occasion many times in the past and in local situations. But there's nothing in the Bible that says the wrath of God cannot begin before the 70th week of Daniel. So, although all of the 70th week is the wrath of God, that doesn't mean the wrath of God has to start then, because putting the seals before the tribulation makes a lot of things work. And I've said before that nobody has a handle on the whole picture of what is to come as far as the timing of things, and sometimes not the sequence. But what we know is that the Jews have to finish burning weapons after the Gog Magog war by the midpoint of the tribulation. And that's what we're going to go into detail about today, is when is this Gog Magog war. But as far as using this as a limiter, the burning of weapons for 7 years as the aftermath of that, it seems to me the best place that works the best is at the midpoint of the tribulation, which means it has to start. The Gog Magog war has to be 7 years before. And I just realized I haven't given Droid a chance to say hi. Sorry about that.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Paul, for having me. I pray the Lord bless every one of you this day.
Awesome. Sorry about that. I just got right into it and forgot my manners. So anyway, um, what I'm saying is that if the Gog Magog war starts with the seals, that means it has to be 3.5 years before the start of the tribulation, so that 7 years pass before the midpoint when the burning of the weapons has to end. That's my reasoning on that. But we can get back to that. Just know that this chart has been updated. There's been confusion about the mention, and that's all it is, of Gog and Magog in Revelation 20 at the end of the millennium, when Satan is released again. But many, can't say most, many commentators hold that to mean just a reference to this kind of catastrophe. Good to see you, Chow, and Nathan, everybody else, Martin, and of course, Droid. So it doesn't have to be the same war. It has to be a war like that, which it is. But there are too many differences that everything would have to be identical, and they're not. There's things like how the armies are defeated and what their motives were for invading Israel and so forth. So I don't have a problem with the late mention of Gog Magog, but if it happens that the Jews finish burning their weapons at the midpoint of the tribulation when they have to drop everything and run, then that means Gog Magog must be 3.5 years before the first seal, which is when Jacob's trouble starts, which means there's plenty of time here for the seal judgments in the 3.5 years and a whole bunch of other things. So, but I do know also that if that is the wrath of God, which it must be because the first seal is opened by Jesus, he causes these things to happen. It's the wrath of the Lamb, as it's acknowledged by the sixth seal. And so that's when the wrath of God begins. But it doesn't have to, the tribulation doesn't begin until the Antichrist signs a 7-year treaty with the leadership of Israel. That's who the many are. It's a Hebrew expression, I think I've mentioned before, that it's talking about all the leadership of Israel. And so there's been no such 7-year agreement. There have been other 7-year agreements involving many nations, but not one specifically with Israel. And so that's what will start the tribulation, which will last 7 years. But the wrath of God, the seals, can start 3.5 years earlier. Some people say longer, but I don't see how there's a balance, there's a sweet spot between how bad things already are and how much still has to happen that kind of limits that gap between the rapture and the start of the actual tribulation. But the 3.5 years makes a lot of sense too. There was I think his name was Jack Kelly or somebody like that, that said, what if it's 7 years total before the midpoint, then people will say, oh, this is the end of the tribulation and the Antichrist has defeated, or the person they don't know as the Antichrist, but they take as Christ, has defeated all these enemies. And so they will be fooled into taking the mark. So there's a lot going on here. It's like multiple layers of chess at the same time, but somehow it'll all fit together. But this is the best scenario I can come up with. So now we have to verify whether Gog of Magog war can be put in this time before the tribulation. And we're going to, I don't have these in the order I really want here. I think I'm going to start with this one. So I may be jumping around a little bit today. This article, I don't know if you have the link there. I'll just grab it real quick and put that in the chat. 8 reasons for a gap of time between the rapture and the tribulation. This person says, let's see if I can find out the name. Stephen Nelson, I don't know who that is, says, I have for a long time believed the trib would begin immediately after the rapture, and it may. However, I've recently been enlightened by the fact that there is no scriptural proof of it. The only thing we know for sure is that the tribulation will begin when the Antichrist signs the 7-year covenant of peace with Israel. That's Daniel 9:27. Also, logic seems to indicate that after the rapture and before the signing of the covenant, there will need to be a period of time. And this is what I'm talking about with all the things that have to happen. Most scholars estimate that this gap of time would need to be anywhere between a few months to as long as 10 years or so. However, since Jesus likened the times as birth pangs, which normally increase in intensity and frequency toward the end, most scholars think this gap period will be shorter rather than longer. Here are 8 reasons for having any gap of time at all. Number one, they use the term global. Sorry, nothing I can do about that. I'll say worldwide. Turmoil after the disappearances caused by the rapture will require time for things to settle down. And absolutely, there would have to be, you're not going to have us all disappear and then suddenly there's an agreement with Israel's leadership. So there has to be some gap of time. That's not the question. The only question is how long. So there needs to be time for explanations and for resetting the world, basically, like people did like world leaders did after World War II. So these things take time. Point 2, no scripture indicates that the Antichrist will confirm the 7-year covenant immediately after the rapture, which marks the beginning of the tribulation. As I showed, I'm going to put this over here next to my chart, that there's the wrath of God can begin before Jacob's trouble, which is the 7-year covenant. So the Antichrist will be revealed immediately after the rapture when the restrainer, the Holy Spirit, is taken out of the way. That's according to 2 Thessalonians 2:6-8. However, we don't know how long it will take for him to sign the peace covenant with Israel. Number 3, the world false religious system will take time to develop. Absolutely. Immediately after the rapture, with all the turmoil, this will probably be when the false religious system, also known as the great harlot that rides the beast in Revelation 17, the woman riding the beast, will come together and will ride the Antichrist into power. That's what she does. She rides the beast, and there's a kind of tense symbiotic relationship between the two, but eventually at the midpoint, the beast will turn on the woman and devour her and destroy her. And that's when the Antichrist declares himself God. That's the abomination of desolation. So he's like, no more of me standing behind false religion. We're going to do away with all of it. And now you worship me as God, he'll say. But anyway, this false religious system that lasts for at least 3.5 years It takes time to develop. Immediately after the rapture, this will be the false religious system will come together and will ride the Antichrist in the power. This global religious system, sorry about that, will take time to develop, and the Antichrist will probably not want to confirm the peace covenant until the religious system is in place. Okay, but once in place, it will serve to assure Israel that he wants peace. So the religious system, by this person's opinions, will serve as the path for the peace agreement signing. Point 4, time will be required for the fourth world kingdom to develop. Daniel 7:23-25 tells us this kingdom, a revived Roman or empirical empire system with 10 kings, will arise and devour the earth, and then the Antichrist will arise and subdue 3 of the kings. And he says much of this may happen before the tribulation. I think the subduing of 3 kings happens at the midpoint. But the point here is that this time will be required for the fourth kingdom to develop with the 10 kings, which again, the chaos after the rapture will be a fertile ground for such a system to be set up. We already know there's a world government under the surface of things, the deep state, but it will become overt instead of covert and be the actual way that the world runs from then on. It won't be nations as we know them, which they've been trying to erase the borders of for quite some time now, as we all know. Point 5, a gap in time will allow more time for Israel to build the temple, which must be in place before the middle of the tribulation, when it's prophesied that the Antichrist will enter the temple and sit as God, according to 2 Thessalonians 2:4. And just FYI, Droid, I don't know how often I'm going to stop to have you read anything because there's so much to cover. So if there's something you really wanted to go over, just stop me and let me know. Yeah, go ahead.
Understood. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Number 6, the gap of time will allow time for the Antichrist to move the world's commercial center to Babylon, which will be the new world's headquarters. I've wondered about this for many years in the past, that there doesn't seem to be any city in the world that fits all the criteria that Daniel and Revelation and the other prophecies lay out, because it has to be an ancient city that is the center of world commerce and eventually world religion. It has to be both of those things, because the woman is riding the beast, right? She's intertwined with it for the first half of the tribulation. And so there has to be, by the Bible's definitions and criteria for these things, there has to be a world headquarters of an ancient city and in the area of Babylon. So I used to kind of lean toward the Vatican because it's an ancient religious system, but it's not, even though it is quite wealthy, it does not have the center of commerce that is required for Babylon. Right now, we have 3 world city-states. We have the Vatican, the religious center. We have the Corporation of London, which is the financial center. And then we have Washington, D.C., which is, at least used to be, the industrial military center, although we have been stripped of most of our manufacturing capability. We still have an extensive military, and people still pour tons of money into it. That is to say, the taxpayers unwillingly. And then there are black ops and all that sort of thing. But manufacturing itself has been taken elsewhere. But we are the military arm of the 3-headed beast, you might say, or the another unholy trinity. But none of those cities are ancient, and they have to be to meet the criteria. So there needs to be time before the tribulation for this world headquarters to be set up and to be the center of world commerce. Point 7, Israel will need time before the tribulation to burn weapons of war. This is what I was talking about with the Gog Magog aftermath, where they burned those weapons for 7 years. If the Ezekiel 38 invasion of Israel begins after the rapture, which it most likely will, some suggest that since at mid-trib Israel will be forced out of their land, according to Matthew 24:16, the burning of the weapons will have to begin at least 3.5 years before the tribulation begins, since it will take 7 years to burn them. according to Ezekiel 39:9. I think this event could actually happen before the rapture or at any time. So again, this is why I have the chart up here of this possible scenario where I have it as the second seal, the Gog Magog War, because first we have the Antichrist coming out of the 10-nation kingdom, right? Then we have Gog Magog taking advantage early on after the rapture and having made an agreement with the Antichrist that they feel secure. And that's the motivation for Gog of Magog to invade the land, because they want to take a spoil. And so I have that as the second seal. And then there's, of course, predictable aftermath. But this time to burn the weapons after that war is over requires 7 years. And the question is, how long can that go on, especially in the second half of the tribulation? Why would it go on at the end of the millennium where Gog and Magog is mentioned again? And there's just, all these little details we'll get into as far as trying to pinpoint when that could possibly happen. But it's my opinion, just to say up front, and this person's opinion, that it has to be either before the tribulation or very early on in it during the seal judgments. Point 8, the gap will allow for a necessary period of peace. People forget about that. Since the Antichrist will need to be known as a peacemaker in order to sign the covenant of peace with Israel, according to Daniel 9:27, there will need to be a period of time after the rapture to develop that peace on earth, because chaos after the rapture and then the formation of the 10 kingdoms to rule the world. But these 10 kingdoms at first have to be creating peace. Look, we've gotten rid of all these national boundaries. And then he says there are 3 things that may help establish that peace, which will really be a false peace, which the Bible talks about when they say peace and security, sudden destruction will come upon them. Point 1, the rapture itself may be used by the Antichrist and the world to say, now peace can come since all the troublemakers are gone, aka Christians. Point 2, the establishment of the new world religion will bring to the world a sign of peace, a false unity, and a false peace. And point 3, it's possible that the Antichrist will take credit for Israel's success over the Arab invaders described in Ezekiel 38:39. Now, I don't think they're all Arabs. I think, specifically not Saudi Arabia. We know they take a back seat to a lot of things. And they just sit back and do a mild diplomatic protest when Gog invades Israel. And lots of political reasons for that. But the point is that, especially if we take Psalm 83 into account with the immediate neighbors of Israel, if Israel winds up with their land, it may be that the Antichrist takes credit, and that's why the Jews then want to build him a temple. It makes a lot of things fit. So he says here, indeed, 1 Thessalonians 5:3 indicates there will be a period of peace, a false peace, when all will be saying peace and safety, or security. He's got safely there. That's a typo. But then destruction will come suddenly. This sudden destruction, I think, will come shortly after the signing of the covenant, when the tribulation begins with World War III, Gog Magog, basically, and indicated in the 7 seals. So, and that's 1 Thessalonians 5:3 says, when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction comes on them as travail on a woman with child. Anything to say before we go past that point of how much sense it makes for there to be a gap of time between the rapture and the tribulation? Oh, why is my phone ringing? Anyway. I don't see any. I don't hear any. Good to see everybody. All right. Let's go on to the next thing. I'm going to put this definition of Rosh over here, because this one, it does a better setup for that, where it says we're going to talk about who, what, when, why, where, and how on the participants, or the who, and etc. of this Gog Magog war. And so we're going to see the text of Ezekiel in here, and then we'll ask who Rosh is, because that's a big question as well, in defining who Gog is and who Magog is, or I should say where Magog is. So the overview of Ezekiel, the whole book, is given here. First 24 chapters are a judgment on Judah, the one of the split kingdom of Israel. Then 25 through 32 chapters of Ezekiel are judgment on Judah's near enemies. And then Ezekiel 33 through 48 is the restoration of Judah, which includes all 12 tribes at that point, because they included that by the time of Christ. Chapter 33 is the transitional chapter. Ezekiel receives news that Jerusalem has fallen. This is, of course, back in his day in BC. Ezekiel is recommissioned with a message of restoration and hope that he delivers in chapter 34 through 48. Chapters 36 and 37 prophesy the physical restoration and spiritual regeneration of Israel. 38-39 focus on God's eschatological judgment of Israel's far enemies. That would be Gog, Magog from the far or uttermost north. And so that's what 38 and 39 are about, after all the other things that are going on in Ezekiel. And just this word eschatological, of course, means of the end times. Some people pronounce it, I keep thinking of that scene from Star Wars where 3PO says, I don't know where your computer learned to talk, but it has a most peculiar dialect, because some people say eschatological. They really lean on the cat syllable, and they'll say all sorts of other really weird pronunciations. I don't know why they do that, but anyway, it's eschatology is the study of end times. But they go on here to say the prophecy of Ezekiel 38-39, which is Gog Magog, can divide it into two main sections: the defeat of Gog in 38 and the disposal of Gog in 39. It's not two separate wars. The prophecy of the battle of Gog and Magog begins with a list of 10 proper names. The name Gog, which occurs 11 times, is a name or title of the leader of the invasion. So Gog is the leader. It's clear that Gog is an individual, since he's directly addressed several times by God, and since he is called a prince. Many modern scholars have identified Gog with someone called Gigas, or it's spelled with U's, Gugu, I guess, or Jugu, I don't know, who was a 7th century BC Lydian king mentioned in inscriptions of the Assyrian monarch, whatever. I'm not going to try to say that. Since the setting of Ezekiel 38-39 is eschatological, this G person who reigned a century before Ezekiel cannot be the fulfillment of this prophecy. So we can rule this guy out. He lived before the time of Ezekiel. The same guy never led an invasion into Israel, but it's possible that Ezekiel uses this guy as an archetype or symbol of the great coming invader. The other 9 proper names in verses 1 through 7 are specific geographical locations. And all 9 of these are found in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, 2-7. All of those names, you can read them there. The only one that's questionable is Rosh, but it's likely that the name Rosh is actually derived from the name Tiras in Genesis 10:2. Someone named Clyde Billington notes the Akkadian tendency to drop or change an initial T sound in a name, especially if the T was followed by an R sound. If you drop the initial T from Tiras, you're left with Ras, and it makes sense for Ras or Rosh to be listed in Genesis 10, since all the other nations in Ezekiel 38, 1-7 are listed there. So I never knew this before about this Akkadian thing, where you can get this name Rosh from. It goes on here, none of the place names in Ezekiel 38, 1-7 exist on any modern map. Ezekiel used ancient place names that were familiar to the people of his day. While the names of these geographical locations have changed many times through history and might change again, the territory remains the same. Regardless of what names they carry at the time this actually happens, these are the areas that will be involved. Each of these locations will be briefly examined and a modern counterpart will be identified. So we're going to find out where Magog is. According to Josephus, the ancient Scythians inhabited the land of Magog. The Scythians were a northern nomadic tribes who inhabited the territory from Central Asia across the southern steppes of modern Russia. Magog today probably represents the former underbelly of the Soviet Union, which includes Kazakhstan and all these other stands and things. Afghanistan could also be a part of this territory. All of these nations are dominated by Islam, with a combined total population in excess of 60 million, so they could field quite an army. Now we get into Rosh. Modern prophecy teachers have often identified Rosh with Russia. However, many have begun to question this identification. There are two key issues that must be resolved to properly interpret Rosh. Is it a common noun or name, or does Rosh have any relation to Russia? Now, as a common name, the first point to consider is whether the word Rosh is a proper name or a common noun. The word Rosh in Hebrew simply means head. That's why you have something called Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year. Head, top, summit, or chief. That's why many translations will render it the chief of Meshech and Tubal. It's a very common word and used in all Semitic languages. It occurs over 600 times in the Old Testament. Many translations render Rosh as a common noun and translate it as the word chief. The King James, Revised Standard, English Standard, New American Bible, and New International all adopt this translation. However, the Jerusalem Bible, New English Bible, and New American Standard Bible all translate Rosh as a proper name, including a geographical location. Or, I'm sorry, not including, indicating. The weight of evidence favors taking Rosh as a proper name. There are 5 arguments that favor this view. First, the eminent Hebrew scholars Kyle and Gesenius. I do know the second name, Gesenius. Or there was we had an old family doctor when I was a kid named Giesenhuis. That's how he pronounced it. Anyway, we'll go with Gesenius. Both hold that the better translation of Rosh in Ezekiel is a proper noun referring to a specific geographical location. And I've read, and they'll go over this, I think, in this article, that how Giesen, who's part of his research on this, was simply ignored in many of the lexicons. Why they did that, I don't know. And then commentators will look at the lexicons, not know of Giesen-Huss's research, and render it simply as chief, the common noun. Second, the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, translate Rosh as the proper name Ros. This is especially significant since the Septuagint was translated only 3 centuries after Ezekiel was written, much closer than any modern translation. So if we go by the Septuagint, way closer to the time of Ezekiel, it's a proper name. The ancient Greek translation of Symmachus and Theodotion also translated Rosh as a proper name. The mistranslation of Rosh in many modern translations as an adjective, that chief, can be traced to the Latin Vulgate of Jerome. So while we do get some information from there, the Latin Vulgate was unfortunately too influential and did a lot of things wrong that have been perpetuated. Third, he says many Bible dictionaries and encyclopedias in their articles support taking it as a proper name. Here are a few examples. New Bible Dictionary, Wycliffe Bible Dictionary, International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. All take it as a proper name, though. Fourth, Rosh is mentioned the first time in Ezekiel 38:2, and then repeated in 38:3 and 39:1. If Rosh were simply a title, it would probably be dropped in these 2 places, because in Hebrew, when titles are repeated, they're generally abbreviated. So since Rosh isn't abbreviated, it's probably not simply a title. So it's a proper name. Fifth, the most impressive evidence in favor of taking Rosh as a proper name is simply that this translation is the most accurate. G.A. Cook translates Ezekiel 38:2, the chief of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal, not the chief prince. It's a redundancy in most translations that take it as chief prince. Well, what's a chief prince? So they're saying the chief of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. So Rosh is a proper name of a geographical location. He calls this the most natural way of rendering the Hebrew. Daniel Block says the issue revolves around whether Rosh is the name of an ethnic group or a common noun. Both Septuagint and the Masoretes argue for the former. Having established that Rosh should be taken as a proper name of a geographical area, the next task is to determine where this is. Is it Russia? Many scholars totally dismiss any notion that the word Rosh in Ezekiel 38:39 could have any possible connection to modern Russia. There's a lot of reasons that they'd want to go the other way now, because this is something that flows with the political winds. So, or tides. You mixed 2 metaphors. Sorry about that. But anyway, it says here that one argument against identifying Rosh with Russia is that it's impossibly anachronistic, since the name Russia didn't appear until the Middle Ages. That's what you hear most on the internet. Others maintain that those who identify Rosh as Russia base the connection only on the similarity in sound between the two words. On a Bible Answer Man radio broadcast in 2002, Hank Hangreff asked Gary DeMar, the preterist, what he thought about Tim LaHaye identifying Rosh as Russia, since the two words sound so much alike. DeMar responded, the idea that you can take a word in Hebrew that sounds like an English word and go with that and create an entire eschatological position based on that is nonsense, and I agree. But DeMar's argument is a straw man. All competent scholars would agree that one should not equate an English word with a Hebrew word just because they sound the same. And I wish people today on the internet would listen to that. You can't make up stories based upon similar sounding words in different languages. There are two reasons for identifying Rosh with modern Russia. One, William Gesenius, or Gesenius, my early memories of the name overrode me there, for I wasn't paying attention, who died in 1842, is considered by modern Hebrew scholars as one of the greatest scholars of the Hebrew language. Unquestionably believed that Rosh in Ezekiel was a proper noun identifying Russia. So this guy with street cred says it's Russia. Gesenius says that Rosh in Ezekiel is a proper noun, that's what the PR.N means, proper noun of a northern nation mentioned with Meshech and Tubal, undoubtedly the Russians, who are mentioned by the Byzantine writers of the 10th century under the name the Ross, dwelling to the north of Taurus, as dwelling on the river Ra, which is today known as the Volga. This identification by Gesenius cannot be passed over lightly. As far as we know, he had no eschatological axe to grind. That is to say, he didn't have a preferred prophecy view that he was trying to fit this into. Yet objectively, he says without hesitation that Rosh is Russia. In his original Latin version of the lexicon, Gesenius has nearly 1 page of notes dealing with the word Rosh and the Rosh people. This page of notes, this is what I was talking about earlier, does not appear in any of the English translations of Gesenius' lexicon. They left it out. Those who disagree with Gesenius have failed to refute his sizable body of convincing evidence identifying Rosh with Russia. They just pretty well muzzled him in hopes that nobody will go look. Second, there's considerable historical evidence that a place known as Rosh was very familiar in the ancient world. While the word has a variety of forms and spellings, it's clear that the same people are in view. Rosh or Rash is identified as a place that existed as early as 2600 BC in Egyptian inscriptions. There is a later Egyptian inscription from about 1500 BC that refers to a land called Reshu that was located to the north of Egypt. How far north? We don't know. The place name Rosh, or its equivalent, is found in at least 20 times in other ancient documents. 3 times in the Septuagint, 10 in Sargon's inscriptions, once in this other guy's Assurbanipal cylinder, once in Sennacherib's annals, and 5 times in Ugaritic tablets. Rosh was apparently a well-known place in Ezekiel's day, the 6th century BC, when Ezekiel wrote his prophecy. Several bands of the Rosh people lived in an area north of the Black Sea. Where's that? Way north of Israel, up into Russia, or their territories. After providing extensive evidence of the origin and early history of the Rosh people, then tracing them back, Clyde Billington concludes, historical, ethnological, and archaeological evidence all favor the conclusion that the Rosh people of Ezekiel 38 and 39 were the ancestors of the Rus or Ross people of Europe and Asia. The Rosh people who are mentioned in Ezekiel were well known to ancient and medieval writers by a variety of names, which all derive from the names of Tiras and Rosh. Those Rosh people who lived to the north of the Black Sea in ancient and medieval times were called the Rus or Ross or Rox or Eorsi from very early times. From this mixture with Slavs and with the Varangian Rus in the 9th century, the Rosh people of the area north of the Black Sea formed the people known today as the Russians. Edwin Yamauchi is often quoted by preterists as a conclusive authority that Rosh can't be Russia. He says it was brought into the area of Kiev, north of the Black Sea, by the Vikings only in the Middle Ages. However, while Yamauchi is a respected scholar, his conclusion stands in direct opposition to the substantial historical evidence presented by Gesenius, James Price, and Clyde Billington. So I don't think there's any doubt or anything you're going to find in the internet that will refute the claim that Rosh in Ezekiel 38:39 is Russia. Okay, I know I'm going fast, but so much to cover. Now, what about Meshech and Tubal? Because people say Meshech sounds like Moscow. Meshech and Tubal are normally mentioned together in Scripture. In his notes in the Schofield Study Bible, and no, Schofield cannot be dismissed just because he's Schofield and a dispensationalist, as many people like to do. Sorry if the name triggers anybody, but we're going to run with this. Identified Meshech and Tubal as the Russian cities of Moscow and Tobolsk. Schofield wrote that the primary references to the northern European powers headed up by Russia all agree. The reference to Meshech and Tubal, Moscow and Tobolsk, is a clear mark of identification. Now, he's going to kind of critique that a little bit. While the names do sound alike, this is not a proper method of identification. Remember what was just said earlier about not making the mistake of similar sounding words. Meshech and Tubal are mentioned two other times in Ezekiel. In 27:13, they're mentioned as trading partners with ancient Tyre. In Ezekiel, that's Tyre, and I know the Brits spell that ordinary car tire with a Y, so it's going to be confusing to somebody no matter what I say. But anyway, it was the name of an ancient city. In Ezekiel 32:26, their recent defeat is recorded as highly unlikely that the ancient Tyre, modern Lebanon, was trading with Moscow and the Siberian city of Tobolsk. Siberia is way north. The preferred identification is that Meshech and Tubal are the ancient Moskoi and Tibaranoi in Greek writings, or the Tabal and Musku in Assyrian inscriptions. The ancient locations are in modern Turkey. Now, this is why some people say that the Gog of Magog thing is all in modern Turkey, that's the far north, the uttermost north. They call that Turkey. Turkey is actually more west, northwest, but whether it's the uttermost, you can argue back and forth, but the fact that Rosh absolutely means Russia doesn't mean that these other places can't be in Turkey, and so Turkey will be included. Yeah, it sounds the same after several vodkas. You got that, Chow. Now, Persia are found 35 times in the Old Testament. The variations, the land of Persia became the modern nation of Iran. Nobody doubts this in March 1935. And then the name was changed to the Islamic Republic of Iran in 79. They have 68 million people. Ethiopia is Kush. The Hebrew word Kush is often translated Ethiopia in modern versions. According to the Brower Driver Briggs Gesenius Hebrew English Lexicon, the ancient Kush was the land and people of northern Nile Valley or Upper Egypt, extending from Syene indefinitely to the south. Ancient Kush was called Kusu by the Assyrians and Babylonians, Kos or Kas by the Egyptians, and Nubia by the Greeks. Secular history locates Kush directly south of ancient Egypt, extending down past the modern city of Khartoum, which is the capital of modern Sudan. Thus, modern Sudan inhabits the ancient land of Kush. Sudan is a hardline Islamic nation that supported Iraq in the Gulf War and supposedly harbored Osama bin Laden, but that's a whole different rabbit trail. Now, who is Put? It's clear from ancient sources that Put or Fut was a North African nation, and many references there. From the Babylonian Chronicle, it appears that Putu was the distant land to the west of Egypt, which would be modern-day Libya. The Septuagint renders the word as Lubus. The big old lexicon, we'll just call it for now, also identifies Put with Libya, modern Libya, Islamic nation. This is written in a time when it was, I think I said just 2005 or something, when Gaddafi was still there, or Gaddafi. He's, of course, not there anymore, but it's still the same land. Gomer, who's that? Often identified as Germany, or more particularly the east part of Germany before the fall of communism. It's funny how people stopped saying East Germany after that for fulfilling prophecy. Gomer is probably a reference to the ancient Cimmerians or Chimmerioi. Ancient history identifies biblical Gomer with the Akkadian Gimira and the Armenian Gamir. The Cambridge Ancient History states that the Assyrian Gimir, whatever, is the Hebrew Gomer. Beginning with 8th century BC, the Cimmerians occupied territory in Anatolia, which is modern Turkey. So we're back in Turkey again. Josephus noted that the Gomerites were identified with the Galatians who inhabited what is today central Turkey. So it can be part up as far north as Germany, but it's mostly, it seems to be south of there. Who is Beth Togarmah? The Hebrew word Beth means house. So Beth Togarmah means the house of Togarmah. It's mentioned in Ezekiel 27:14 that as a nation that traded horses and mules with ancient Tyre. Ezekiel 38:6 states that Beth Togarmah comes from the remote parts of the north with all its troops. Ancient Togarmah was also known as Tilgaramu, Assyrian, or Hittite, and its territory is in modern Turkey, which is north of Israel, northwest. So they give a chart here of the ancient names and the modern names. And the modern names, I'll just read real quick. We have Russia, Central Asia, and possibly Afghanistan. So mainly the stands are as Magog. We have Turkey, Iran, Sudan, Libya, and some more turkeys there. Based on these identifications, Ezekiel 38:39 predicts an invasion of the land of Israel in the last days by a vast confederation of nations from north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, extending down to modern Iran in the east, as far as modern Libya to the west, down to Sudan in the south. Therefore, Russia will have at least 5 key allies: Turkey, Iran, Libya, Sudan, and the nations of Central Asia. Amazingly, when you consider that Islam didn't begin until the early 600s AD, amazingly, all of these nations are today Muslim nations, and Iran, Libya, and Sudan are 3 of Israel's most ardent opponents. Iran is one of the axis of evil nations that is trying desperately to attain nuclear weapons. Who knows who has what? I don't care. Hotbeds of militant Islam or strengthening our ties. List of nations. Read like a who's who of this week's newspaper. So he's saying the list of nations in Ezekiel 38:39 reads like today's newspapers. It does not require a very active imagination to envision these nations conspiring together to invade Israel in the near future. When's that? Is the next question. So that we're to the when question of the who, what, why, when, where. Okay. There appears to be a general consensus concerning the basic composition of the invading army in the course of events. By far the most controversial is the setting or timing of the invasion. So we know where they're coming from. We know who's involved. Concerning this issue, one would be wise to follow the advice of Clarence E. Mason. One thing is certain: no teacher should speak dogmatically on a prophecy like that of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38. Should be 38:39, not 39 twice. So many different views have been offered that it's difficult to sift, discard, and retain. It's the details, particularly as to the time of the action, regarding which there is disagreement. So we know who it is, we know where they are, we just don't know when. There are 7 views concerning the timing. Let me just grab a quick drink, and maybe this would be a time for you to say anything if there's anything in the chat or whatever. All right, before they learn to spell their name. Got it. Ciao. Excellent. Okay, preterist view. That is to say, everything's already done. Preterists contend that events like this have already occurred. Gary DeMar, we mentioned earlier, argues strenuously for a literal interpretive 38:39, that is to say, not literal as anyone would define it that uses the literal method, because that involves context, many layers, and that includes time and all sorts of things, and all these issues we've been listing so far. And he repeatedly criticizes Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins for interpreting these chapters symbolically, therefore spiritualizing the text. So it's trying to make the charge against literalists that they're not being consistent. DeMar insists that Ezekiel 38:39 was literally fulfilled by the events described in Esther 9, occurring in about 473 BC, in the days of Queen Esther of Persia. DeMar states that the parallels between the battles and Esther are unmistakable, but are they? DeMar, however, fails to account for several clear differences between those two things. A simple reading of the two passages reveals they cannot be the same. Here are the 5 of the more problematic inconsistencies. In Ezekiel, the land of Israel is invaded. In Esther 9, Jews are attacked in cities throughout the Persian Empire, and they defend themselves. In Ezekiel, the enemies fall in the mountains of Israel, and Gog is buried in Israel. In Esther, the enemies die throughout the Persian Empire. That's just one of the differences. The second difference, the Jews buried the dead bodies over a period of 7 months to cleanse the land of Israel where the dead bodies fell. In Esther, there's no need to cleanse the land because the bodies are not in Israel. Third one, the invaders are destroyed by a massive earthquake in the land of Israel. They have infighting, plagues, and fire from heaven. God destroys them supernaturally. Whereas in Esther, the attackers are killed by the Jewish people themselves, assisted by the local government leaders. The next one, invaders are from far west as Libya, as far north as Magog and the land of Scythians. The Persian Empire in Esther never included these areas. It only extended as far west as Cush and as far north as the northern part of the Black and Caspian Seas. And then the last one, God sends fire upon Magog and those who inhabit the coastlands. There's nothing even close to that in Esther. So Demar is quite frankly wrong. One important question we might ask at this point is, if Ezekiel 38:39 was fulfilled in Esther 9, why did this escape the notice of everyone in Esther's day? Why is there no mention in Esther of this great fulfillment of Ezekiel's prophecy? And why are there no Jewish scholars in that day or since who recognized it? An important Jewish holiday known as Purim developed out of the Esther event. This is a joyous annual holiday to celebrate God's deliverance of Israel from the hand of her enemies. The celebration includes a public reading of Esther, but no tradition has developed or even heard of in which the Jews read Ezekiel in connection with this observance. Formally, Ezekiel states in general terms when the invasion will occur, because we're still trying to find out when. In Ezekiel 38:8, he says specifically that this invasion will occur in the latter years. Thanks for that. That's so helpful. It's the only occurrence of this exact phrase in the Old Testament. Well, that might be helpful. The Old Testament only says latter years once. Okay, so another similar phrase occurs a few verses later in Ezekiel 38:16. It will come about in the last days that I will bring you against my land. This phrase is used in the Old Testament in reference to Israel's final time of distress or to their final restoration in the Messianic kingdom or the millennial kingdom. It's in Ezekiel 38:16, in the last days is a technical term that refers to the end times. Therefore, Ezekiel is telling us the invasion will occur in the final time of history in preparation for the establishment of the Messianic kingdom of Christ. Another very simple reason we know this invasion is still future is that nothing even remotely similar to the events has occurred in the past. When has Israel ever been invaded by all the nations listed there in Ezekiel? Or when did God ever destroy an invading army with the fire and brimstone and heaven from heaven and plagues and earthquakes and infighting? Never has happened. That's because Ezekiel is describing an invasion that's still future even to our day. Now that was the preterist view was destroyed. Now it's the pre-trib view, the one I hold. The other 7 views of the timing are all held by futurists. So the preterist view has been dismissed. So they're all future views. The first is pre-trib. This is held by Tim LaHaye, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, I've mentioned before, Thomas Ice, and Randall Price. There's a view expressed in the Left Behind series, which I've never read, by the way, where the Gog and Magog invasion occurs before the rapture. Those who hold this view that the invasion will occur before the tribulation begins, they're 2 different events, and possibly even before the rapture. However, in keeping with the imminency of the rapture, they carefully avoid saying that it must occur before the rapture. It doesn't impress me either way that it has to happen before or after. It has nothing to do with the rapture. The pre-trib view has 2 main strengths. It fits well with the 7 years for burning weapons and 7 months to bury the dead. And by pre-trib view, we're talking about something that happens before the tribulation. Okay, not just the rapture. There are other things that happen before the tribulation. All this can be before the tribulation. Under this view, let's see, that pans out with the 7 years of burning weapons. It provides a reasonable explanation for how the Jewish people would be able to construct a temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. If the armies of many of the major Islamic nations are decimated in Israel before the tribulation begins, the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem can be accomplished with much less Muslim resistance. So it answers that question by being before the tribulation. This view has 2 main weaknesses. However, first, according to Ezekiel 38 8 and 16, the invasion will occur in the latter years or last days. As noted above, these expressions appear to refer to the final time of Israel's distress. So that they're taking that final time as being only at the end of that final time. These chronological indicators point to a time period before or a time period after the beginning of the tribulation rather than a time within the church age, which again, I'm like, if there's a gap, it can still happen after the rapture, but before the tribulation. So I could quibble with him about that. The second weakness he sees is the invasion will occur at a time when Israel is at rest, living securely, and dwelling in unwalled villages. Those are all terms from Ezekiel 38-39. Fruchtenbaum maintains that the Hebrew word batak in this appears, which appears in Ezekiel 38:8 and 11, simply means security. He says this is not a security due to a state of peace, but a security due to confidence in their own strength. This too is a good description of Israel today. The Israeli army has fought 4 major wars since its founding, won them swiftly each time. Today, they are secure and confident they can repel any invasion. That's the end of his quote. It is true that the inhabitants of modern Israel live in unwalled villages and have some degree of security due to their military might. However, they're not at rest as required by Ezekiel 38:11. The Hebrew word translated at rest means be quiet and undisturbed. This hardly describes Israel today. The nation is one huge armed camp. The people are disturbed on a regular basis by threats and homicide bombings. Since 48, when they were established, has lived under constant threat of terrorist attack and invasion. The terminology of Ezekiel 38 fits much better with the first half of the 70th week. So he's saying that this must happen after, which is like what I have here as the second seal. So it's still before the tribulation, though, but it's after the wrath of God begins. And that's during a time when Israel will enjoy the protection of her covenant with the Antichrist. Some people will say first half of the tribulation, but I am running out of time and I have so much more to cover because I wanted to go over this. I might just do this now and go back to the other. Well, no, I've got a third thing to do. Too many things. Anyway, you can read the rest of this. I don't know if I put the link in the description. It's in the description, but I'll put it here in the chat. Yeah, I don't know if I want to do a part 2 because I don't know. There's just I don't know how much detail I want to just sit and read to you. You know what I mean? I just want to make a point of who is Gog and when is this going to happen. Okay. But anyway, there's other views of the timing that you can go through and a two-phase fulfillment and all sorts of things. But let's get to the why here. The fourth issue is the purpose. And I've mentioned this before about motivation. The human and divine purpose for the invasions are given. The invading force will have 4 main goals. 1, to acquire more territory and amass wealth, or 2, to amass wealth. 3, to totally destroy the people of Israel. And 4, to directly confront and challenge the Antichrist or the West, which I've said before, I think the Antichrist is the West, who will be Israel's ally as a result of the covenant. This fourth purpose is only valid if one accepts the first half of the tribulation as a setting for the invasion, which is, I have the second seal is still in God's wrath, but not necessarily in the first half of the tribulation. The divine purpose is in allowing this invasion is expressed in 38:14 through 16. Through the attack, God will be sanctified in the eyes of the nations. So people will know that God did this. And isn't it just a coincidence that at the 6th seal, people say, hide us from the wrath of God? So that's why I'm still going with this scenario. Anyway, other things happen as well. I mean, the armies are defeated and the 7 years burning and all that. So now we get to the what question, beginning in verse 13 and continue through 39:20. The text focuses on the invasion, the fate, and the aftermath. It will make other invasions look like child's play. When Russia assembles the last day strike force, it will look like Israel is finished, but God is in control. And when God that invades, the Lord God declares that my fury will mount up on my anger, and they are annihilated. Not only the armies, but their lands they came from, or as we might say in America, the horse you rode in on. God will intervene to rescue his helpless people, and we use 4 means to destroy the invading army: earthquake, infighting. That is to say, they turn on each other. disease and torrential rain, hailstorms, fire, and burning sulfur. The famous Six-Day War occurred in 67. This will be the one-day war, or even the 1-hour war. It won't take long. The aftermath of that is that, first of all, the scavenger birds and beasts will feast on this great army. God calls it his sacrifice. Second, the burying of the dead for 7 months, and then the bringing of weapons for 7 years, the third one, and then the blessing of salvation. So God is showing mercy, and this is how this is a catalyst for turning at least some people in Israel, probably 1/3, back to God, but they will mistake the Antichrist for the Christ and offer sacrifices. And then when he declares himself God is when their eyes are finally open and they take off. What about the weapons being burned? There's all sorts of scenarios there that I just don't have time for. But you are welcome to read about that. Islam also has a version of this war where they win. Anyway, you can look at modern political alignments and see how these things are panning out. Anyway, who are Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish? It says in Ezekiel 38:13, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all its villages as lodging and laying protest. I mentioned that earlier. The phrase with all its villages, or the young lions of it, as the KJV has it, it should be just all its villages. It doesn't mean young lions. After the name Tarshish is a Hebrew idiom referring to the nations that come out of Tarshish. The question is, where was ancient Tarshish? Some maintain that it was what today is England. If the location is accepted, then all its villages would include the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, any of the so-called colonies. Ancient Tarshish is probably the Phoenician colony in what is today Spain. Tarshish is also mentioned in Ezekiel 27:12. If this identification is accepted, all its villages could refer to the nations of Central and South America, and could include North America, since Spain was involved in discovering North America and ruling over parts of it for a time. So it could be the Western continent. Or it's possible that Tarshish was the farthest known land to the west of Israel, could denote all the nations of Western Europe. Whichever view one adopts, Ezekiel 38:13 indicates that Saudi Arabia and at least some part of Western Europe and nations that have come from it will object to this invasion by Russia and an Islamic horde. And that's all they'll do, a diplomatic objection. Although Saudi Arabia is no great friend of the West, she is one of the Islamic nations that consistently serves her own self-interest by conveniently aligning herself with Western nations. Thus, the mention of a protest by Sheba, Dedan, and Tarshish corresponds with current developments. So they conclude, events in our world today strikingly foreshadow the prophecy of the Battle of Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38:39. All the necessary antecedents are in place or moving there. And as I said, this was written, I think, in 2005. The Jewish people have been regathered in unbelief. The Middle East peace process is front and center in international diplomacy. The invaders are identifiable nations who have both the desire and the potential to fill the Gog prophecy. In his commentary on Ezekiel, published in 1987, Criswell wrote these timely words concerning the prophecy. Ezekiel lived 2,500 years ago, and yet he writes as though he were a correspondent for the daily newspapers of the earth. What he says is so pertinent in this moment that it is as though he lived in the places where history is unfolding before our very eyes. That's the end of the quote. The remarkable correspondence between world events and what Ezekiel predicted is another indication that the coming of the Lord could be very soon. I don't know about you, but I think this article does a fantastic job of laying it all out, what the possibilities are, what they aren't, ruling out things that can't be, and how this aligns with our modern world. Now, this will be short on who Rosh is. We're just looking at several different dictionaries. The Easton's dictionary says it's rendered chief in the authorized version, meaning the KJV. Left untranslated as a proper name in the revised version. Some have supposed that Russians are here meant. They invaded the land of Judah, and et cetera, et cetera. Hitchcock's dictionary just says, no, it means the head. Smith says Rosh is reckoned among the sons of Benjamin. That's all it says. Oh, that's for, well, they got that twice. And then they say a proper name, referring to the first of three great Scythian tribes, of which Magog was the head. International Standard Bible Encyclopedia has just a son or grandson. Oh, I guess they're giving these separate as, okay, I see the 1 and 2 now. First definition is a son or grandson of Benjamin in Genesis genealogies. Then the second one is they give several different possibilities, Rosh and his renderings, and they go through the same material. Identification with Russia, and probably the Assyrian Rasu. So they corroborate the main article we went through. And I'll just give you this link here in case you don't have it, because I keep forgetting to do such things. Oh, I think you already have that, don't you? Yeah, sorry. You were already on it, Droid. Sorry about that. At least I didn't post it yet. Okay, now there's this one. You can grab that link too on the Gog and Magog War, and it's got very similar information, but it has more of the actual text, which I wish I'd had time to read through. But we do the analysis part here. You can read anytime, but use several different versions, especially some of the more modern ones, because I think they're more accurate than the older ones, which didn't have as much of the context included apparently in their choices of translation. But they give you, the text, and then they talk about it. And here's a handy little map of Meshech, Tubal, and Beth Togarmah are the green area. Because I don't know if you can read that. It's kind of small. Persia is the purple area. That's Iran. Kush is the yellow area. Sudan. Put is over here in the purple. These are both purple, but this is the bluer purple on the left side, going all over the top of the continent of Africa. Gomer is this area they have in Germany and south of there. And then other nations involved are in this kind of gray area above the darker purple on the left. So they give all sorts of points and information that are just corroborating the other article, basically, is why I had this up. And they have a little timeline here of events, which I may or may not agree with. But just to let you know, those are there. So you can also reference this one, which I might have mentioned before. I don't remember if I did, but I don't agree with everything at this site, of course. But I like the idea of puzzle pieces. I had a puzzle piece on the cover of my one prophecy book years ago because it's like a jigsaw puzzle. And like any jigsaw puzzle, you look for the corners and edges first, the limitations, the things that rule other things out, whether it's timing or area or genetics or whatever it is. If you're trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle, you look for the limits first. And that's what we do with Bible prophecy. And in principle, such things as if it's a time where people are still mortal, it has to be no later than the millennium. That's an edge in a corner piece. So I recommend that method of study, but this is yet another thing on the Gog and Magog, what they call the Great Middle East War, which I think is their reference to the Psalm 83 war. Let's see. Chow says, I posted this earlier. I think it's interesting. Thus has the Lord God showed me, and behold, a swarm of locusts coming out from the east, and one caterpillar, King Gog. Let's go see what's in Amos 7. Oh, okay, that's what it says in the Septuagint. I'd like to see what the Net Bible has about that. But do look at this article. It has history and all sorts of things and other perspectives. Let's go and find Bible Gateway and look for, let's see, Amos 7. Real quick. Let's see, that we have the contemporary English on the left. It says, going to send locusts to attack your crops. It will happen after the king has already been given his share of grain and before the rest of grain has been harvested. Let's see what their footnotes are. Okay, they talk about locusts. Okay, harvested. Let's look. Check the Net Bible. The Sovereign Lord showed me this. I saw him making a locust just as the crops planted late were beginning to sprout. The crops planted late sprout after the royal harvest. Okay. Not seeing any note about caterpillars. What does that say again? A swarm of locusts can be, and behold, one caterpillar, King Gog. Huh. You would think they'd at least mention it in the footnotes on the Net Bible. Let me go and get the Septuagint Hebrew parallel. And we'll look up Amos 7. Or Amos 1. Verse, I don't know where I was getting. Oh, no, it is Amos 7. Sorry about that. All right. Let's see. Late the crop, beginning of the crop, late and indeed the late crop mowings of the king. Because the other versions, the English ones might be going by strictly the Masoretic text. Let's see what we got here. A locust coming in the early morning. Behold, grasshopper one Gog the king. Grasshopper, or that's interesting that. Oh, an olive tree. Okay. It must be a different Septuagint version that has caterpillars, but it's just, this is, we can look up what Bruchos is. And come on, I clicked on it. Go there. Open link in new tab then. All right. Thunder. I hate it when they do that. Sometimes they put the wrong Strong's number. Never mind. I'll look it up some other time. But that's interesting. And it clearly says Gog the king. When it shall be cleared, devouring the grass of the land. Yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for letting me know. Parisha translation, I'm not sure. Are you talking about Peshitta, Martin? I've never heard of Parisha translation. Oops. Now I want to highlight and copy. I think you might mean Peshitta, but I'm not sure. Yeah, that one I don't. Oh, okay, Peshitta. Yeah. Oh, let's type right. All right. There's a New Testament. It's an Amazon book. I don't know if I'd be able to see it online. An important early translation, in case anybody didn't know, dates to the AD 400s. All right. Yeah, I don't know where I can go read it. I'll have to look around. But yeah, that's interesting that the Septuagint had Gog there. I'll have to do further research to find out why other people don't have it. Oh man, I didn't mean to close that tab. Oh well, I'll get it back. Anyway, we're past our hour, of course. As far as weeks to come, Christmas and New Year's Eve fall on Sundays, so I will not be live streaming. I may put up a short video sometime around then on the Star of Bethlehem, just a real quick look into it and put up a quick video sometime. But I will not be live streaming on New Year's Eve and Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve. After that should be pretty well normal for a long time, whatever normal is. But as far as being careful with text, people say the same thing about the Masoretes, the Masoretic text, which postdates the New Testament also. That's all well and good, but if there are errors in the text before they started perpetuating it, then those errors get carried along for a long time. the important thing is to go back as early as we can to original language texts, which are going to be Greek and Hebrew. And the Septuagint predates the Masoretic text, of course, by hundreds of years. So I do tend to lean on the Septuagint more for a lot of things. But as far as who Gog is, these other people that we mentioned in the main article that did all this research, they're convinced that they know that Gog is the name of a ruler, that Rosh is the name of a place, and that these are involving Russia and as far down as south as Turkey, involving quite a few other nations in the east there, east of Europe. So anyway, if you find let me know if after the live stream is over, you can post under this video if you find it's only if you're, I think, a mod, you can post a link, or you can just tell me the name of a site and I'll try to find it. Or you can, if you have contact with me in Element or Discord or something like that, or Skype, you can give me the link there. But I don't know of any way you can, go against these people who have done the studies in identifying that Gog Magog war of Ezekiel 38 is coming from the far north. It'll be a coalition of nations that involves Russia, and it will happen before the tribulation, as far as the setup for it happening before the tribulation, but after the seals start. Now, if the seals start the wrath of God at the same time, then I still have this happening here, but there's so many things that have to happen before. Why not put the seals here, especially since there's a war mentioned in, the red horse of the four horses of the apocalypse fits so many things. So, and like I said, we have to have 7 years of burning weapons after that Gog Magog war before Israel has to take off, and they're not there to burn them anymore. So anyway, good to see you, Rachel and Spider Monkey and everybody else. Anyone else I missed, I'm sorry. And Martin, of course, Chow, Droid, Nathan, and Crockett, and whoever else I missed. Rachel Menifee, I think I mentioned. Titan Long, and I hope I got everybody. Thanks for coming. As I said, I don't know what I'll be doing next week. It'll probably be prophecy related. Because there's, like I said, there's so many things to happen. Maybe we'll go back into some of that other stuff as needed to explain things, but we'll see. Anyway, thank you very much for coming. Spread the word, and we'll see you sometime in the future. Don't know when that be. Oh, good to see you, Adam. Condolences to you. I just heard about that before the show. His mother passed away, so everybody prayers for him and his family, her family. And we'll see everybody later someplace else today, probably. Anyway,